Hello, everybody. So we're continue on with this lecture. Honestly, this is a lot for one lecture, so I'm glad I broke it up into two. And I think the next one is not too long, so they kind of go together well. But anyways, last time we stopped off talking about equivalent capacities for culture, right? And that is specifically what I talked about last time was like a lot of people talk about humans being equal, but they don't really know why or how they're equal. Cultural anthropology has an explanation, and it is because everyone has the equivalent capacity for culture, right? Um, and you know, that is something that is kind of hard to wrap around for people. People might disagree with this at its core level, but in anthropology, if you believe the things that anthropologists are saying, specifically in cultural anthropology, then you will agree with this, or you kind of have to agree with this statement, right? So everyone can learn the cultural fundamentals of anything, right? And I think to make it a little more clear, this last point, right? Similar cultural causes have produced similar cultural results. So, of course, like a lot of professional athletes, people like to use that as an example. Will they become as good as like Kobe Bryant or whatever? Probably not. But, you know, you can produce similar cultural results if you have the the know-how to do it, right? So let me give you an example, and this is with Harvard, right? So let's talk about Harvard. What do you need to apply to Harvard? You need SAT or ACT scores. You need your grades. You need a personal statement, and you need letters of recommendation, right? These are kind of like the base thing that you need. Now, you know what's funny was that I actually during COVID was trying to find another like source of income, and I tried to be a Kaplan, which if you guys ever heard of Kaplan, it's a test prep agency, and I tried to be a Kaplan tutor basically, right? And for the GRE, which is the kind of like the graduate school SAT. I did the test, right? There's English and math. The English side, no problem, 90, 95, fifth percentile, whatever. But for the math, I scored like below 10% or below like 20%. It was pretty bad. I was like, okay, no problem. I can't do this. Let me move on to something else. So let me try to do the SAT, right? Kaplan actually and most tutoring centers or whatever make most money on SAT because of going to undergraduate schools. Funny enough, for graduate school, they don't really look at that stuff too much, but they do want to know that you have a basic understanding of writing and reading and stuff. I remember when I went to grad school for anthropology, they didn't even care that I scored so low in the math. They just wanted to make sure my writing skills and stuff were up to par. But it doesn't matter. So SAT, right? So I was like, okay, English again, same thing, very high score. But for math, I still scored really low, 30%, right? So the reason I'm telling you this is in order to get to Harvard, what do you need? Remember those four things: grades, letters of recommendation, personal essay, and the SAT score, right? So if I were to apply to Harvard right now, me myself, if I were to apply to Harvard right now, I would not get in, right? Because my SAT score is so low. That being said, sorry, yeah, undergraduate program, right? So like, the BA or BS program. But if I were to apply to their anthropology program, their graduate anthropology program, meaning for the PhD, I have a pretty high chance of getting in. Okay. So this is crazy, right? Because you would think that someone that could get into the PhD program would also be able to get into undergraduate program. But that's not the case. Why is that? It's because the cultural standards for these things, those four things that I mentioned earlier, is not met by me. In addition, now I know how to do it, but in the past, I did not know how to write a personal statement very well. I knew I can write like I can write like research papers very well actually, right? But I can't write a personal statement. So already I have two things that are going against me applying for undergraduate degrees. Okay. And it's funny because again, I need you to think about that. I can literally go to a PhD program at Columbia, probably, right? Like that's a pretty realistic thing for me. But it'd be very, very difficult for me to get into the undergraduate program. There's actually like almost no chance of me getting into the undergraduate program. So the first thing I always hear students saying to each other, like, "Oh, you got in this school or whatever, you know, you're so smart, this and that." It has nothing to do with your intellect. It has to do with, do you know what to do, right? If you are to grow up in a family where they are very familiar with how to go to school, you will be doing things to get you into school, right? So, for example, if I were to have kids or if I were to guide some little kids into going to school, it'd be much easier for them because I already know what Harvard wants. I already know what Columbia wants. I already know what all these, Ivy League schools, these good schools want and need. So it would be much easier for the student that I'm mentoring, whether it's my kid or not, to get into these places. Why? Because I'm familiar with the process, right? That's why I can give you guys, well, I mean, in the future, if you guys have need advice on like school related stuff, I can give you advice about that because I've been through it. I know it very well, right? So this is different, right? Because for people that don't know it well, they will not be able to succeed in these areas, not because they're not smart, but because they just don't have familiarity with it, right? It's the same thing for sports as well. And again, I'm going to refer back to my own experience, right? If my kid or a kid wanted to become like a professional Muay Thai fighter, I kind of know exactly what to do, where to send them, and how to use their time uh, efficiently so that they can get there with the least amount of struggle, right? It has very little to do with how good you are. It's more to do with, do you know how to get to where you're getting, right? Or sorry, do you know how to get to where you want to go? Okay. And this applies to all things. So when we say that people have the equivalent capacities for culture, it means that everyone has the capacity to learn this culture, right? Will you be the best Muay Thai fighter in the world? No, but I can probably get you to like a pretty high level or pretty high pretty what's it called? Popular stage. The same thing with school. Are you going to be like, the graduating, what is it called? Valedictorian? Maybe not, but I'll get you there. You can probably get into Harvard, get into Columbia pretty well. Okay. So it's less about how smart you are or how good at a certain sport you are. It's more about, do you understand how to get to this place? And the more that the more resources that you have, and when I say resource, I say that purposely, it's not just money, it's also understanding. The easier it is for you to get this done. And what does that mean? That means that all people can essentially do the same thing if they are given the same situation. And that's that last part right there, right? Similar cultural causes have produced similar cultural results, meaning that if my family or whatever really emphasizes school, it is no surprise that the students or that the kids will be going to school in a way that is more efficient or more with more know-how, right? Again, will they become valedictorian? Will they all be majoring in whatever physics or English or whatever? No, they all be doing different things. But because they are familiar with the system of going to school, they will end up with a better or with a more similar cultural result, right? And the same thing with people that play basketball, right? Or sorry, the families that really know how want their kid or really are familiar with the process of putting their kids into like or of basketball, right? The kids might not again, they might not get into the NBA, but they might be able to get in collegiate programs. It might be a walk on for like some college teams or university teams, which is way more than I could have done for in terms of like basketball for sure. So it's less about your intellectual or physical abilities. It's more about, do you know how to do this stuff? Okay. So, culture and individuality. Cultural rules provide guidance about what to do and how to do it, but people don't always do what the rules say should be done. People use their culture actively and creatively rather than blindly following its dictates. So, this kind of goes back to the human imagination thing. Obviously, this is like a little deeper. The human imagination just kind of touches on it. But, when we talk about cultural rules, it doesn't tell us what to do. It just provides us like a framework, right? It doesn't control what we do. It doesn't like dictate what we do. Okay. Again, easy example is like, don't have sex before you're married. Clearly, a lot of people have sex before they're married, even if their cultural rules say not to do it. And even though it may not have affected that decision in particular, because they obviously had sex before marriage, what it does influences their behavior around that topic. Okay. Anthropologists find it useful to distinguish between ideal and real culture. Ideal culture consists of what people say they should do and what they say they do, and real culture refers to their actual behavior as observed by the anthropologist. All right, so ideal culture is basically what people say they should do. Real culture is what they actually do. That's basically that's pretty straightforward, right? And it doesn't give you the exact answer. So let me give you an example. I'm studying this dude, and this dude keeps on telling his friend's mom, "I love your cooking." But every time he says it, he just doesn't come over to eat though. He has a lot of opportunities to come over to eat, but he never comes over to eat. Why is that? Right? So does he actually love his mom's cooking? Is there something else going on that's preventing him going there to eat? That is the kind of real culture playing out. Like what is actually happening? Does he hate his mom's food, but he's just being polite? Who knows? Right? So these are the kind of things that anthropology to pay attention to because again, when we talk, a lot of times we aren't necessarily articulating the truth, even if we don't know it, right? Um, if I were to ask you, hey, do you hate this class? Your answer would be very different than if you were answering your friend asking you that same question, right? And that is a big part of why we need to observe behavior and not just the words. Okay. So ethnocentrism ethics. Ethnocentrism is a tendency to view one's own culture as superior and apply one's own cultural values in judging the behavior and beliefs of people raised in other cultures. Cultural relativism is the opposite and is the viewpoint that behavior in one culture should not be judged by the standards of another culture. So ethnocentrism is judging other people based on your own cultural values, right? So like an extreme example would be Hitler, right? That's a very extreme example. But ethnocentrism exists in all of us and everyone in much smaller ways, right? And actually is uh sorry, give me 1 second. Um so in smaller ways, right? So like for example, you know, I was raised to speak very quietly on the train. And I'm on the train and there's a bunch of people that are really loud, right? And because I was raised to speak quietly, I'm like, oh, those people are uneducated, those people are rude, those people are stupid, whatever, this and that, this and that. In reality, it has nothing to do with whether they're stupid or rude or not rude. It has more to do with they were just raised to believe that it's okay to be loud on the train, just as you were raised to be quiet on the train. Same thing, right? But because of the cultural differences there ends up being a judgment. And that judgment is the part that's ethnocentric, right? That person could have easily, or not easily, but that person could have been like, hey, they were probably raised differently. So they're not being rude. I don't like it, but they're not being rude or they're not being stupid or uneducated or whatever. They're just raised differently, right? That is a very different judgment and answer than, oh, that person's uneducated, that person's rude, blah, 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 right? So ethnocentrism is, again, judging other people based off of your own cultural standards, okay? Now, cultural relativism is the opposite of that, right? Is basically that other people are raised in different cultural standards and that's it, right? So again, same situation. You just be like, hey, these people are being loud on the train. I don't like it, but they're just probably just raised that way. They're not being rude. They're not being whatever. They're just different. That's cultural relativism, right? And now remember, cultural relativism ethnocentrism is not like you dislike other cultures. It's that you're judging other people based off your own cultural values, right? And same thing, cultural relativism. I hate it when people are loud on the train, let's say, right? But guess what? I don't think that I don't add the extra judgment of like, oh, they're rude or they're uneducated and stuff like that because they're just from a different background. Okay, great. Sorry, give me 1 second. Yeah, okay. So, mechanisms of cultural change. Globalization, a series of processes that work transnationally. Okay, so wait, what, is this the first one? Is this the first one? No, yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so mechanism of cultural change. Basically, how does culture change? And these are kind of like four big causes of change of culture changing, right? Diffusion of traits between cultures. Cultures have really never truly been isolated, right? So basically, when a culture meets another culture, things get exchanged. Acculturation, unfortunately, is the ongoing exchange of cultural features that results when groups have continuous first-hand contact. So what's the difference between acculturation and diffusion? Acculturation is basically when it's a little more forced. So in this case, it's talking about colonization in particular, right? So certain languages, for example, they are created through being colonized, and they have what they call pidgin languages, like Creole. That's a mixture of the native language in addition to the colonial language. Okay. Independent invention is the process by which humans innovate, creatively find solutions problems. So basically, when humans innovate things, it creates a lot of cultural change. Obviously, the internet is an easy example, but I like this one right here. Gerrymandering. If you're into voting or if you're into politics, this is a big one, is where they purposely break up certain types of districts so that it falls in favor of their voting, right? They'll purposely break up this district so they can have two districts that vote for them versus one, or they'll purposely break up this district so that they end up voting for them instead of someone else, whatever. The main point is this is an example of independent invention that really affected our political system. Finally, globalization, a series of processes that work transnationally to promote change in a world in which nations and people are increasingly interlinked and mutually dependent. International commerce, finance, travel, tourism, transnational banking, and media. So these are all things that are it's kind of like new, right? For to be more global, to be more connected globally, it's more new. It's very new. And a lot of companies, a lot of our culture is moving toward that, right? Being more global. Um, yeah. And if you look at a lot of global companies, they actually have a very similar way of operating. If you look at like their policies or like the way they do customer service, the way they do business, it's actually very similar. So globalization is actually a cultural, not only does it cause a lot of cultural change, but also is it's become its own cultural thing that people kind of try to imitate. Okay. So full circle, right? What does it mean between something natural and something being cultural, right? So something natural is something that's biological or passed on genetically or biologically, right? Something cultural is something that is learned. And that's kind of the definition or the way I want you to think about cultural. It are things that are learned, right? So like language, for example, is learned. And you'd be surprised how much of your opinions are learned, right? It's not to say that they're not unique. You build off those opinions, right? Like I said, culture is scaffolding. But the big difference between natural and cultural is that cultural things are learned. Okay. All right, so announcements. I'll probably go with this again on the next one, but you know, uh, just the quiz is due at the end of this week. All right, cool. Let me get the next PowerPoint. Right. Nope. Yeah. Right. No. 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 There we go. All right. So on to the next chapter, chapter 16. So to go to anthropology. Announcements again. Just the quiz is due at the end of this week. All right. So we're gonna watch a quick video, and we are going to look at it together afterwards. I almost forgot. Oh my goodness, this thing just keeps on freaking pooping out. Let me pull it up. So this is the jelly bean video, and it's a pretty great demonstration of or explanation of race, ethnicity, and nationality. Oh, there's a little bit of advertisement here. You guys should be able to see it. Yep. All right, so this is a pretty good video, and we're gonna talk about it later. But how do I just share something else? Can I just do that? Just do that. Now I am unsure because again, I haven't used what's it called? I haven't used Brightspace a lot for this particular thing as much. But yeah, right. Is that good? Are we sharing the screen? Yeah. Right? You guys are seeing the PowerPoint. Actually, you know what? Let me just redo it, and then that'll be make sure. So this is my first time using Zoom to play these videos, and it might flag a YouTube thing, trademark thing. So you might have to watch this via Zoom. But regardless, uh, if the audio and stuff is not clear, just watch it again. It's linked everywhere. It's linked to the PowerPoint and everything, so just watch it. But yeah, so it's like, when you watch this video, right, it just gives a clear definition of the differences between the three categories: nationality, race, and ethnicity, right? Nationality is the easiest. Nationality is probably the sorry, race is the easiest because it's the color of the jelly bean, right? That means the colored person. The major races that exist in America is white, black, Native American, Asian, and Hispanic. Those are the major ones. Obviously, they change depending on where you are and when you are, but those are the kind of the major ones, right? So, for example, an example of race would be black, right? Now, ethnicity is the flavor of the jelly bean, which is the ethnic heritage background of a person, right? So you could be black, your race could be black, but your ethnicity could be Jamaican. Your ethnicity could be Trinidadian, it could be Dominican, it could be Ethiopian, whatever, right? Those all fall under the category of black. Okay. Now, nationality is a little interesting. Nationality in the jelly bean video is the bag of jelly beans, right? So like kids mix, the fruity mix, the whatever mix, no matter what kind of jelly bean it is, it can exist in multiple bags, right? It's the same thing with people. You could be of Ethiopian background or of Ethiopian ethnicity, but have the nationality of American. If you move to America, get citizenship, right? Or you could be the nationality of like Brazilian. If you move to Brazil and get citizenship, okay? So the bag of the jelly bean of nationality is based off of what? It's based off of your citizenship. Okay. Remember, a lot of students get confused. It's not where you're born, it's where you hold citizenship. Okay. So wherever you hold citizenship, that is your nationality. Okay. So it's pretty clean cut, pretty straightforward. So when we think about race, ethnicity, nationality, when do these things come into play? Right? These things come into play a lot because well, at least in your day-to-day life, it comes into play a lot with filling out forms for school, for a job. You have to fill out these things often, or surveys, census surveys. This is kind of where we see it most of the time. Okay, so we're gonna circle back and talk about the rest of these questions. So ethnicity. Ethnicity is based on cultural similarities with members of the same ethnic group and differences between them and other groups. Ethnic groups share certain belief, values, habits, customs, and norms because of their common background. So ethnic groups, this is very important. The second bullet point right here, what do they share? They share culture. That's very straightforward, right? They share a cultural background. Now, this gets a little spicy because your ethnic background is, or your, what should I say? Well, actually, you know what? I'll explain it later. It's okay. But this is what it is. Now, what's very interesting about ethnicity, though, is that ethnicity means identification with and feeling part of an ethnic group and exclusion from certain other groups because of this affiliation. Ethnicity is not the only basis for group identity, right? So when we're talking about this one in particular, it is not just that you feel part of a certain type of group, but you also feel excluded from other groups. That's very important. Excluded, not just included. Okay. Now, the definition for minority groups, which I think is a great definition that we have here in the PowerPoint, is that minority groups occupy a subordinate position within a social hierarchy. inferior power and less secure access to resources that do majority groups, right? So what defines a minority group here is when they have less or inferior power and less secure access to resources than do majority groups. Does this mean that minority groups cannot be rich and well-resourced? Of course not. But what it does mean is that it is more difficult for them to become rich and well-resourced. Okay, so now we've come to this question: what is the difference between race and ethnicity, and why might this matter? So race is literally your appearance, right? And ethnicity is your whatever, your cultural heritage. Okay, so why is it important to distinguish between the two? Now, you guys might not care so much about this, but when we think so on a more practical level, when we think about Asians, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? You probably think about East Asians, right? Like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, right? So a lot of times in places where there's a lot of East Asians, Indians, South Asians are not included, even though they're included under the banner of Asian, right? Now, this is all fine and dandy, okay? It becomes a problem though when, for example, let's say, and especially this is especially in California, there are a lot of Southeast Asians that need a lot of academic and financial support from the government, right? They should qualify for some of the benefits. And on top of that, they should be counted as as a diversity group that, deserves extra attention. However, because there are a lot of Asians that go, for example, to UCLA, when it comes to them, they are usually excluded from this category simply because of our category Asians, right? So the problem here is, yes, there are a lot of East Asians in UCLA. However, if you're Laotian, if you're Cambodian, if you are Thai, right? There are a lot of instances especially in Southern California, where they have a lot of hardship growing up, right? In more typical ways, rough neighborhood gangs and stuff like that. You could just look up Cambodian gangs, California. There's a bunch of stuff that comes up. But the main point is, because we are not breaking people up in a good way, because we are all categorizing these people under Asian, and we assume that because there are a lot of East Asians that go to UCLA and South Asians, that these people, specifically Laotians and the Cambodians, do not have enough support. Sorry, should be excluded from the financial and academic support that should be provided. Right? Just because they are Asian does not mean they fit very well into this category. Right? And so they do not have a lot of the scholarship monies, or the support to pay for school, or the academic, like the tutoring support or whatever that you would have as a financially challenged, or as someone from a rough neighborhood or whatever background should have. Does that make sense? Okay, so in that way, it's pretty unfortunate that they're categorized as Asian in this particular case, right? And so again, the main problem with that is that this broad categorization ends up hurting people from getting certain types of resources, right? In this particular case. Now, there's a lot of other things. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. So race, what is race? Race is when an ethnic group is assumed to have a biological basis. Race, like ethnicity in general, is a cultural category rather than a biological reality. Popular culture rarely distinguishes between your ethnicity and race, right? So race, as we learned, is your basically the how you appear, right? It's the larger category. So race is really just based off of appearance. Now, a lot of people like to think that race is based off of biology, but aside from maybe skin color and the size of I don't know, like your forehead or something, that's where the biology stops. Everything else after that is not based on biology, right? We are associating certain cultural things with biology, and we assume that it's true, but in reality, it's not, right? Most Americans acquire their racial identity at birth, but race isn't based on biology or on simple ancestry, okay? So if biology was actually based sorry, if race was actually biologically based, then they would be basing it on ancestry, right? Like where you're from. But this is not a very accurate description because, for example, they say if you're black, they say, oh, okay, you're originally from Africa, which is partially true, but it's also like, how far back are we going? Because we're going really far back, then everyone's from Africa, right? So it's not about. So what do you really mean when you say, oh, people are from Africa in the last like 400 years? That's a very specific thing. That's not really what you mean. What people really mean by you're from Africa, you're African American, and what they're trying to say is that you're black. That's it, right? So like even the categorization of like Hispanic, what does that even mean? That you speak Spanish? Congratulations. Like, when we talk about Latin America, like, are you really talking about those individual peoples? People who live, well, if everyone, you guys know this, people who live in the Caribbean who speak Spanish are very different from people from South America who also speak Spanish, right? So, all this stuff that race is based on biology is a bunch of BS. And here's some extra examples right here. So, if again race was based on biology, then these things wouldn't exist. So, for example, in America, mixed black children are still considered black, right? This is called hypodescent. A great example is Drizzy Drake, right? Is Drake black? Yes. Is he Jewish? Yes. But which side does society see him as? As black? It's because of the way he looks, right? It has nothing to do with his biological ancestry. It's the way he looks. So, you know, how do I know society views him or accepts him as being black? Is because he uses the N-word. It's that simple, right? And there's less problems with it than someone else who is half black using the N-word, right? So, for example, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Rashida Jones. Rashida Jones is actually half black and half white, and her sister, who her sister is more black appearing, have different experiences in their going through life, right? And that is simply because one appears more black and the other one appears less black. And if, again, we were basing this on biology, then we would be judging both of them the same. And we would be holding Drake to different standards. Does that make sense? Right? But it's not based off biology. It's based off of how we view things, right? Sorry, how we're seeing the appearance of a person, right? This next one is not as relevant to you guys, but it's very relevant in Arizona, actually, where I went to school in Tucson. There's a lot of people with Mexican, or I should say South American descent, but mostly Mexican. Many Americans with a native or Latino grandparent consider themselves white, right? That happens a lot at least at the University of Arizona, right? Where someone is white appearing, but they actually are Latino and they have like a Latino ancestry, but they still claim themselves as white. Now, this is only possible because they can pass skin color wise as white. I guarantee you, if they looked a different way, they would not be able to pass as white, and that qualification would not be there. Okay. So again, if we are basing if race was based in biology, then we would be looking at these categories very differently. But we don't, right? Race, what is race? What is race actually? It's just how you look. That's it. Okay. So, status and identity. Cultural differences also are associated with class, region, religion, other such variables. Individuals often have more than one group identity, obviously. So, in anthropology, status is any position, no matter what prestige that someone occupies in society. There are ascribed and achieved statuses. Ascribed statuses are statuses that people have limited choice about occupying, and achieved statuses, which come through choices, actions, efforts, talents, or accomplishments. Okay. So let's first talk about ascribed statuses. Ascribed statuses are, again, statuses that people have limited choice in occupying, right? These types of um types of statuses are things like race and gender. Those things are the easiest statuses. Sorry, the easiest example to use as ascribed statuses, right? These are statuses that are not impossible to change, but very difficult to change, right? Ascribed statuses, race and gender. So for gender, there's an easy one, Caitlyn Jenner, right? Who used to be Bruce Jenner. She changed her gender, what was it, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever, right? Caitlyn Jenner, okay? She was able to change her gender. Now, this is not changing your sex, two different things, right? You can change your sex, but it's a much more invasive process, right? That being said, though, she was able to change her gender, right? What does that mean? That means that people refer to her as her. She dresses a certain way. She acts as a woman would act in our society, right? Now, again, difficult to change, but possible. Now, Rachel Dolezal, this is an interesting one. So Rachel Dolezal, I should actually just pull up a picture of her. Rachel Dolezal was a professor that basically posed as a Black professor for the longest time. Okay. And unfortunately, she received a bunch of awards for being a Black professor. This is her. And this is her when she was receiving awards and stuff. Okay. So basically, yeah, she changed her appearance to appear Black. It's pretty simple. Yeah, she was, I mean, man, she was like very involved. She did a lot of work. She received like Professor of the Year awards, or I mean, sorry, Black Professor of the Year award. She did a lot of stuff. But anyways, main point again is it impossible to change your ascribed status? No. But is it difficult? Very difficult. Extremely difficult. Okay. Now, achieve statuses, though, come through choices, actions, efforts, talents, or accomplishments. Now, the problem with the word achieve is that when you hear the word achieve, you automatically think positive stuff, right? But it's not, doesn't have to be positive stuff. You can achieve being a convict, right? These are things that you can do. And it's through choices or actions or whatever, right? But you also can choose to become a physician or father, right? But these are statuses that are not assigned to you immediately and are at least compared to gender and race much easier to change. Okay, so that's the difference between ascribed and achieved statuses. Now, situational negotiation of social identity is when one identity is used in certain settings and other in different ones. So the example I have here is very easy, but it gets a little bit deeper, right? If someone were to ask you what's your background and you say Hispanic, or sorry, if you were to fill out a form and they ask you what's your background, you probably say Hispanic. But if I were to ask you personally, hey, what's your ethnic background, you probably say Mexican, right? If like for me, obviously, if I fill out a form, usually I put Asian. If you were to ask me person to person, I put Chinese, or I tell you Chinese. And if I were traveling overseas, I'd be saying American, right? Depending on where I am. So situational negotiation is just basically using different social identifiers depending on where you are, right? And this is not just for race and ethnicity and nationality. This could be for anything, right? If someone asked me, if I went to like some like when I freaking go to Kingsborough, right? I tell them like at the front, what are you doing here? I'm like, oh, I'm a faculty member. I'm a teacher. I'm a professor, right? That's a way that I identify myself. But the main point is situation negotiation is when you're in different situations, you're going to identify yourself differently. So, one thing that's difficult to wrap your mind around is that the way that America looks at race, ethnicity, nationality is different than other countries, right? So I put a couple examples here, Japan and Brazil. So racial attitudes in Japan illustrate something called intrinsic racism, the belief that perceived racial difference is okay to value someone less. Discrimination comes in the form of address and marriage investigators. They are considered unclean. They discriminate against the groups Barakuman and Koreans. Now the Korean discrimination is a little more kind of like your classic, discrimination where they think of them as like, not good people, I guess. But the one I really want to bring up is the Barakuman. So the Barakuman, right? The Barakuman are a group of people, and I had to look this up, from the Tokugawa period, which is 13th century Japan. And the Barakuman were a group of untouchables, basically doing things that people didn't want to do during that century or during that time, during that whatever, yeah, that time period, right? So they, they cleaned up maybe the sewers. They just did a lot of stuff that people didn't want to do, right? Now, one of the things about the Barakuman, right, is because in America we're very used to discriminating based off of race or off appearances. The Barakuman obviously are their appearance is just like every other Japanese person. So what they have to do is before they get married, they have an investigation into their family and their previous addresses to see if they before in the 13th century were part of the Barakuman class. And if they were part of the Barakuman class, then they break off the marriage or whatever. Right? That sounds crazy. That sounds so crazy to me. But guess what? That's what they do. That's how they discriminate. Okay. In Brazil, they have exclusionary racial systems. Sorry, they have inclusatory racial systems, right? Basically, the way that we exclude people on racial systems is not the only way it can be, right? It's in Brazil, they have a lot of different options for your racial background, and racial identity is more of an achieved status. So they put this in the textbook, but in reality, actually, there's been more recent research saying that in Brazil they do discriminate against people who are darker. But what they mean by this example is most of the times what they discriminate people based on geography, right? The Nordestinos in particular, who are thought to be basically like country bumpkins. Like they don't know anything about culture, they don't know anything about living in the city. They're just like, not so smart people, like whatever. They're kind of dull, whatever it is. Okay. Now, why I bring these two up is in Japan and in Brazil, I'm pretty sure they think that the way that we discriminate in America is crazy and it's stupid, right? It's kind of weird that we discriminate people based on like race, for example, right? However, right, like and actually if you follow this YouTube channel, I think actually they recently put a video that the dude's moving out of Japan, but it's okay. They still have great videos. That the it's called a Black Experience in Japan. And it's very simple. They started out just interviewing people that were Black in Japan and how they like living there versus like in other countries or in America. They expanded, I think, to like China and Korea and stuff like that. But one of the main things was, oh yeah, I have a great time over here. The cops don't like follow me around. They do this and that. So a lot of the Black people that moved to Japan have a pretty good experience. Now that being said, though, right? The way Japan looks at America discriminating against Black people seems kind of crazy. It seems kind of weird. But when I told you about the Barakuman, right, that to us is super weird. Okay. And so that's just to illustrate, that feeling you get is like, why are we discriminating against a class of people? It's like 13, that's like from the 13th century. Like, who cares, right? That is exactly how they look at the way we look at race. Does that make sense? I'm just trying to provide a variety of viewpoints. The way that race is constructed is not only this way. It's different in every country, right? It's the same thing in Brazil, at least, according to this textbook, right? They look at the discrimination on race as kind of crazy, but they discriminate based off geography. Like that doesn't even make sense either. Who cares if you're from who cares if you're from the Northeast or the Southwest or whatever, right? So again, we think it's kind of weird, it's kind of stupid, but that's kind of how that's kind of how other countries look at the way we look at race. Okay. So race, again, is not this thing that's biologically determined. Depending on where you are, race has a lot of different associations, positive or negative. Okay. So nation at one time was synonymous with ethnic group. Now nation has come to mean a state, right? So what this basically saying is that like, in the past, nations had a lot to do like with their cultural backgrounds, right? So like that's why if you say the word like Chinese, it's similar to China. If you say like Mexican culture, it's because they're Mexican, right? That's why we name those things. But due to a lot of factors, right, such as migration, conquest, colonialism, most nation states are not ethnically homogenous, which basically means that there's not just one background ethnicity that lives there, right? Now it's a mixture of a lot of different types of people. Okay. Now, ethnic groups that seek autonomous political status are nationalities, examples North South Korea. So it's very interesting. I was thinking about this for a while. I was thinking about like what is an example of a group of people that have the same cultural background the same race and the same ethnicity, but a different nationality. And North and South Korea is a great example, right? Great example. Okay, because well, now not now anymore, but in the past they were basically the same. They are each other. They were all just Korean, and then they got into war, and then they separated, and now it's now they're literally different countries. Okay, great. Ethnic tolerance accommodation. Assimilation is the process of change members of an ethnic group may experience when they move to a country where another culture dominates. Assimilation isn't inevitable, and there can be ethnic harmony without it. So basically, what this one is saying, right, is that assimilation is like when what's the best way to describe it? It's when you kind of lose a part of your original cultural background and replace it with something from your new cultural background, right? Assimilation, a lot of times, when they describe people as assimilated, in this case, they mean like more Americanized, right? So like, um, the problem with the word assimilated though is that it's like you're kind of sacrificing like your previous cultural background, if that makes sense. Like it's not like a happy thing. It's like it usually implies like kind of like an unfortunate sacrificing. So it's like, oh, I used to pray every morning at, whatever, 5 a.m., but now I have to work at 5 a.m., so I can't pray, right? That you are sacrificing that previous culture background for the new requirements of the cultural background, right? But what this slide is saying is that doesn't have to happen, right? There are things called plural societies, which combines ethnic contrast and economic interdependence between ethnic groups, right? A plural society is something like New York City, right? Where you literally have different mini societies within New York City. Okay. Now, what does that really mean though? Because this isn't well explained in most places, in most classes. So, for example, Chinatown, I imagine Brighton Beach and also like Little Haiti and stuff like that, or like the Bronx. There are, for examples, in Chinatown, there are doctors' offices, there are optometrists, there are dentists, there are tax services, right? There are construction, whatever, right? All in Chinese to help people that don't speak English well with these things, right? But what's interesting about these things is that, when you're filing your taxes, you're obviously not filing your taxes for China. You're filing your taxes in America, right? When you hire a lawyer, or a lot of the lawyer service in Chinatown, they are under the it is clear that they need to speak Chinese to you, right? But obviously you're participating in the American legal system. And I imagine in Little Haiti and Brighton Beach, they have the same thing, but in their respective languages, right? So it's like, French or Russian or whatever, right? So these are examples of plural societies. Now, are we using a different language? Yes. Are we coming from a different cultural background? Absolutely. But more importantly, right, we are existing in harmony with the rest of the society. Okay. Remember, I am using this Chinese speaking tax service to complete my American taxes. Okay. So this is an example of plural society. Okay. The view of cultural diversity as good as multiculturalism. This seeks ways for people to understand and interact that don't depend on sameness, but rather on respect for for differences. So one of the things actually I talk about, it was a big deal when I was graduating college, was like, it's different in the city, in cities, because like, again, from San Francisco, it's a lot of diverse backgrounds. Here, I was a lot of diverse backgrounds. Just because you have a different colored person in your picture does not mean you're diverse. If your mom and dad's all work in the same place, they make the same amount of money, who cares if I eat, like curry at night versus like broccoli or whatever, right? Like that's not really what diversity is, right? So how deep is your diversity? So the problem with a lot of places is that it forces people to be in a melting pot. And I don't know if you guys are into cooking, but in a melting pot, everything tastes the same, right? You get a piece of beef, tastes like the stew that you made. Get a piece of potato, tastes like the stew you made, right? In fact, the better way to describe a plural society, or a better way to describe a multicultural society, is a salad, right? Because a salad, you chop up all this stuff, you put into the salad. Let's say you put tomatoes, onions, and lettuce or whatever, right? Once you pour the sauce on it, right? Even though you pour the sauce on it, or the dressing on it, it still has its individual taste. It still tastes like an onion. It still tastes like a lettuce. It still tastes like a tomato, right? These are all things that will still maintain its own taste despite being from a different ingredient, or in our case, a different background, right? So a plural society is basically where people don't need to be the same, but can be different, and that's okay. Okay. Beautiful. All right, so full circle, right? This last question is really important, right? So one of the main things I want you to take away from this lecture is that race, ethnicity, and nationality are all different categories created for convenience, if you will. Okay, or for whatever it is, it's not to really accurately put people in the drawers, right? So you can think of them as drawers, and if you like, when you're a kid, you don't need a big drawer. You can have a small drawer because you have smaller clothes, you have smaller things, whatever. But as you grow older, you need bigger drawers, right? It's the same thing with these categories, right? To put people in, like the definition of black and Asian and white, it's so crazy because, you know, white, like, Eastern European white versus like, you know, Western European white, that's such a different type of white, even though they have the same skin color. Race is purely based off of like what you can see. And when we talk about ethnicity, ethnicity is not a great definition either. You could say that my cultural background is Chinese, sure, but and like actually I'm second generation, so my parents actually came here last already. Is my experience as a Chinese American going to be someone the same as someone that came over like 2 years ago and just got their citizenship? No, it's not a good definition. What if it's like 5 generations down? Should I still be considered Chinese? I don't know, right? So what I want you to take away from this conversation is that race, ethnicity, nationality are all categories that are created by our society for convenience, right? And it's, again, not to say that it's good or bad, but it becomes problematic when we do things like create stats about Black people in America, like Asians in America, because those things aren't accurate depictions. What if there was a stat, which there are a lot, it's like Black families, annual income? Are you comparing the same Black family that just moved here from freaking Trinidad, in Flatbush, to someone that lives in Atlanta and has been, in Atlanta or in America for like 5 generations? Those are two very different families and two very different populations. What relates them? That they're Black? That's crazy. That doesn't makes no sense, right? So even though on some level it seemed like it's not a big deal, but when you get deeper into stuff, and especially for me, because again, when you're doing research, oh, there's all these freaking headlines for all this, oh, Black and Asian family. Like, what are we talking about? Are you talking about the same kind of Asians? Are you talking about different kinds of Asians? Like, what are we actually talking about? Okay. Um, so again, sorry, to full circle. What might a social culture anthropology say about these categories? Simply that they are culturally created, and not that they're bad or good, but they have their limits as cultural definitions or cultural drawers, if you will. Okay. All right, great. So after this week, we're going into some juicy stuff with race, ethnicity, nationality, and also gender. So I hope you guys find that a little interesting. Just a quick note at the end, please make sure you turn in your quizzes. Other than that, you guys are good to go. Oh, and also, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at raymond.fong@kvcc.cuny.edu.